Hey, really quickly, guys, I wanted to talk about VO2 max and heart rate based training. This is science for the uninitiated. So, in the conversation of like cardiovascular fitness, we have two areas of training. One is called VO2 max training, and the other one is called heart rate based training. And this is where you're building up the pyramid of aerobic fitness. So these are two things I really wanted to define before I shut off. VO2 max, amount of oxygen per milliliter by the minute. I'm going to say that again. Amount of oxygen used per milliliter by the minute. So for every minute that goes by and you're training in the VO2 max range, which is your top range, it's the very top of the pyramid of cardiovascular fitness. This is your all-out sprint in layman's terms. The amount of oxygen used in that period of time, which at the upper end could be around 4 minutes. It's going to be 1 to 4 minutes. It usually doesn't supersede that. You want to think like all-out sprint for 800 meters, all-out sprint for 1,000 meters. Maybe even up to, if you're very, very trained and you're in very good shape, maybe even 1,600 meters. That's not really for me to say. If I was to administer a VO2 max training day, I would say, hey man, we're going to do, Peter Attia talks about like the 4x4. You're doing 4 minutes, 4 minutes for 4 sets, right? Or you could do 3x3, 3 minutes for 3 sets. So this is the measurement of the amount of oxygen a person can use during intense exercise. VO2 maxes that are high means that your body is better at taking in oxygen and delivering it throughout the muscles. This allows your body to, this is a stable indicator in how much your body is able to utilize nutrients and metabolize glucose and oxygen as well. Glucose, oxygen, and water. It's VO2 max is like kind of in the new age, kind of being seen as like the telltale sign of how aerobically fit somebody is, or what their overall fitness looks like, actually, because you're pulling from multiple energy systems. It's not just aerobic capacity. This isn't aerobic capacity at all, actually. This is all-out effort. You're pulling from anaerobic, you're pulling from aerobic. For those of you that don't know, anaerobic is exercise that doesn't utilize oxygen. Aerobic is exercise that does utilize oxygen. And that can be kind of confusing because it's like, well, am I holding my breath while working out? It's like, no, not necessarily. Anaerobic will take place between like a heavier load of rep ranges. And more specifically, all-out efforts, efforts where you're doing only a set amount of reps, and these sets of reps are usually on the lower end of the spectrum. When you're lifting weights and you're trying to hit hypertrophy, which that's a whole other conversation in and of itself that we could totally dive into. I don't even have to script that one very well, and I could talk about that one for a good 45 minutes on what hypertrophy is, although that is not what we're talking about today. So VO2 max, the amount of oxygen per milliliter of a minute used. And then, what else? What else on VO2 max do you guys need to know? Telltale sign about how healthy somebody is, at max capacity. It's just a good indicator. It's in the same way that somebody will be tested on their 40-yard sprint in the NFL Combine. It's like, okay, it's a good indicator that this guy has top speed and he's able to get there. And a 40-meter dash is very much sports specific for like an NFL football player during the Combine. Is it a direct indicator that somebody is going to be like the greatest player on planet Earth? No, there are plenty of people who have great 40-yard dashes, but end up not being too great of an athlete. So there are other intangibles that go into, making someone a really well-functioning human being that goes beyond, how fast they're able to move their legs and how well they're pulling oxygen into their lungs to perfuse it throughout the rest of their body. Now, that's why I wanted to bring up aerobic capacity. When you're doing heart rate level training, I touched on this a little bit. If you've noticed, I've touched on this a little bit during the metabolic syndrome conversation, but I think it's really important to iterate, like, hey, what's VO2 max? What's aerobic capacity? And then I think I'll do like 2 more videos on this topic of conversation, and then we can dive into metabolic syndrome. And I already have that scripted out, but it's important to understand, like, hey, well, if these are the mechanisms of action that we're going to be using to stave off metabolic syndrome, if this is going to be the staple, we better understand the staple. So VO2 max, just think about it as your all-out sprint and your capability at the top end, 4 minutes of all-out sprinting. That's very difficult to do. And, if you have to train up to get there, you start at a minute, you do 4 sets of a minute, all-out sprinting. I completely understand that. Aerobic heart rate based training. So we have our 5 zones. In the last video I said 6, that the 6th doesn't exist. So heart rate zone 1, 50 to 60% of your 50 to 60% of your total of your max heart rate. Remember, your max heart rate is taken by the number 220 and then subtracting your age by it. So under this circumstance, I use my age, I'm 26. That drops 220 down to 194. And then I would take 194 and then multiply 194 by 0.5 or 0.6. And then so on and so forth. Zone 2, we have 60 to 70% of your max heart rate. Zone 3, 70 to 80% of your max heart rate. Zone 4, 80 to 90% of your max heart rate. And then Zone 5, 90 to 95% of your max heart rate. And Zone 5 is where your VO2 max training comes in. It's the very top zone. And don't worry, I'm gonna post this script or what I have written down onto the Substack platform. So if you're interested in seeing with your own 2 eyes instead of the audio and video recording, you can totally divert over to Substack and then look at the actual script and say, like, okay, well, these are the portions I want highlighted, and this is what I'm going to take away from this message. Zone 1. This is your maintenance, warm-up, and recovery zone. If you're injured, you want to do this type of training. If you're recovering from a long workout and you just wanted to get a little bit of heart rate stuff in there, it's always worth trying to increase your capacity after a hard bout of training. That's always worth doing. Or just going into your 5-minute warm-up right before you get into the hard stuff. It's arguable to say that you really need to do aerobic based warming up, like a straight distance run at zone 1, 50 to 60% of your max heart rate. It's arguable that you would even have to do that, but if you did want to do that, that's where you would be warming up. Zone 2, 60 to 70. This is your aerobic. This is where you'll be building your actual aerobic base, because you're not pulling from different energy systems. You're still purely in that aerobic, at that aerobic pace where you're not pulling from the anaerobic because you're having difficulty and you're straining and you're reaching hard. That's kind of what I want you guys to be thinking about as far as differentiating zone 3 and zone 2, is that you're going to feel a little bit more lactate buildup when you get into zone 3. You're going to be challenged, especially when you get into zone 4 and 5. That's almost completely anaerobic and pulling specifically from the anaerobic base, the anaerobic systems. And it'll be interesting to dive into the conversation of mitochondria and mitochondria function and how to increase mitochondria. Remember, mitochondria is most abundant in slow twitch muscle fibers, which is really interesting because the individuals who have the highest proclivity for high mitochondria count are individuals who take up marathon running and do it at a very high level. We don't have to dive into what race those people are, but you could guess that they're a majority slow twitch, and at the same time, if they're a majority slow twitch, they have more mitochondria than the average person, which means they can shuttle lactate out of this lactic acid out of their system, switching back and forth between anaerobic and aerobic. Remember, when you're in an aerobic pace, you're pushing lactic acid out of the muscles so that you can then contract more effectively. There's also a big conversation about how lactate is very important for muscle growth and health span and longevity. So it's interesting to think about these different concepts and how they work with one another, and maybe you want a little bit more of like that lactate buildup in opposition to being in a comfortable aerobic pace where you're not necessarily pushing yourself too hard. It's great for heart rate training, not so much for building up muscle. So those are your 5 zones. We iterated what VO2 max was before we got into understanding heart rate based aerobic levels, and that's aerobic capacity is near and dear to my heart. I really believe that somebody has higher stress tolerance, is a healthier overall human being, has a healthier heart if he does aerobically train at every single level, levels 1 all the way through 5. Very diversified aerobic capacity. And that's the thing that we have to be thinking about in Science for the Uninitiated, is we're not trying to iterate one topic of conversation. We want a well-diverse profile of things that we understand, and eventually the picture comes in as a whole and we're better off for it, and that's the reason why I created this archive in the first place. And I'm just happy that you guys are willing to listen a little bit, and maybe you guys check out the Substack as well. In the meantime, I'm gonna go pick some stuff up in the store. Thank you for listening. This is Science for the Uninitiated.